Hi, I'm Donald Davidson. I'm the historian for the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and this is part of the series called Stories with Donald. So in 1963, Team Lotus entered 3 cars, and they for some reason they couldn't call them Lotus Fords because that confused with cars in another series. So they were actually called Lotus powered by Fords were the official entries, and there were 3. And so it was Jim Clark, who was Lotus's #1 driver. I don't think he had any interest in coming to Indianapolis at all, personally. I think that this just was Chapman said, this is where we're going, and so, all right, that's where we're going. But I don't think he had any interest in really being here to begin with. And then Dan got the other car. There were 3 cars entered, but they were only going to run 2 drivers. And so Dan ran the second car, and it just shows how things were different. He was actually contract to Brabham. But, you know, there was, exclusives were not so exclusive in those days, and so Dan got to come and run Indianapolis. So they used Ford stock block 4.5-liter engines, which were based on the Ford that they were using in their passenger cars the first year. And Jim Clark qualified for the middle of the second row, and Dan had a bit of a problem. He had an accident with 1 car, and then they had to hurriedly get out the 3rd car, which they called the Mule. That was the practice car, and so that's what Dan qualified for the race. And Clark's was in British Racing green with a yellow Lotus stripe. And Dan's qualified with the same paint job, but for the race it was changed over to international American racing colors in Grand Prix, which was white with light blue trim. And so Jim Clark came very close to winning the race. There were no mandatory number of pit stops in those days. And so you could go the distance without making a stop at all if you wanted to. But by that time, because of the speeds and fuel consumption and so on and so forth, it was pretty standard for the leaders to go through the race on 3 stops. Well, Clark, running a stock block and gasoline, made it on 1 stop. And that really got the attention of the Americans. That, boy, there's a way to save time on pit stops. You know, don't make any, or make 1, or whatever it was. And so Clark ended up finishing 2nd. Now there's a little bit of a side story here. Parnelli Jones led from the pole and led most of the race. But the fact that he would make 3 stops and Clark won, there was a period where Clark led some laps. Well, late in the race, Jones was leading, and this is sort of like 3/4 distance or so, and Clark had got used to the feel of the thing, and he was now catching up with Parnelli. And then there was a suggestion that maybe some there was a vapor could be spotted over Parnelli's car as he came down the straightaway, and indeed there was a little bit of an oil leak. And what happened was he had an externally mounted oil tank. It's on the left-hand side outside, and there were 2 bolts that held that to the body, and little spider cracks had developed, and it was allowing oil to not pour out, but to spit out. And then there was a little bit of smoke, because I think it was like hitting the exhaust. And anyway, so then there was some concern, he's leaking oil. And Harlan Fengler, the chief steward, had said at the drivers' meeting, any car that's dropping oil will be black flagged and brought in. And if you don't believe me, try me. Well, now, here it is late in this situation. A couple of cars had been black flagged for leaking oil. Now he's in a bit of a position because Parnelli was very popular and he'd led most of the race, and now he looked like he was probably going to win. And in second place is a car that was very popular with the road racing set, but not necessarily the Indianapolis regulars. And so, you know, Jim Clark is a little bit of an outsider, and with Ford Motor Company that hadn't been at the track for decades. How does it look now if I black flag the guy who's leading and then give it to this new team? So that, I mean, that was a pretty perplexing situation to be in. Well, he got the black flag was ready, and I don't know if he was holding it or he'd given it to Pat Badan, who was the flagman. But J.C. Agajanian, who owned Parnelli's car, came. It was a pretty powerful man, and on the USAC board of directors comes over and said, you know, you're not going to black flag him. And Fengler said, well, we're looking at him, and they've got the binoculars if he comes down the straightaway. And then Colin Chapman comes running over, and Harlan Fengler liked to officiate from track side, so he's on the grass verge right next to the pit wall, and very vulnerable for anybody that wanted to run out and take issue. So he's got Agajanian on one side and Chapman on the other side saying, well, what are you going to do about it? You know, you said you'd black flag anybody who's leaking oil, and he's leaking oil. So Fengler wanted to make absolutely sure, and then in the meantime, the oil level had gone down to the halfway point on the tank. So now it was, you know, level and below the crack, so it wasn't spitting out anymore. And so Fengler allowed him to continue on. And so Parnelli won the race, and Clark found it a little bit slippery and dropped back. And then I think he finished second. It was like 34 seconds behind. So there was a huge outcry. A lot of people thought, well, Jim Clark's robbed. And the thing is that, you know, I like to get the point across. Supposedly there was bad feeling between Clark and Parnelli. Well, there wasn't. They had formed great respect for each other. And on the day after the race, for the, you know, what we call the day after shots, there's only a couple of times where I can think of where the runner-up has been at the track and then been photographed with the winner. And if you see the photographs the day after, where Clark and Parnelli are shaking hands and grinning, and they've got their arms around each other, if it refutes any suggestion that there was bad feeling between the two. So anyway, so the point is that Chapman and Clark get second with the Lotus the first time they're there, and Dan Gurney had to make 3 stops. He was trying to get by on one, but they had to make a second stop, and I think there was a minor problem with that, so he had to duck back in like a lap or two later to actually make a third, and he ended up 7th and claimed he was down on power all the time.